What I love about Game of Thrones, homage to the Wars of the Roses, is there are these deep, dirty, tactical struggles in which everyone's betraying everybody else, switching sides. George understands that war is not good and evil, red and white, one side and the other. He understands that with real wars, you don't know when it started, you don't know when it's going to end, and you're not really sure who's right and who's wrong, if indeed anyone is right.
You helped me win the Iron Throne, now help me keep the damn thing.
If there's one character from Westeros who is almost a direct lift from the real-life Wars of the Roses, it's got to be Robert Baratheon. You have this king so adept at what he does that he's able to grab the crown, in Robert Baratheon's case, from the Mad King, in Edward IV's case, from a Mad King, who was Henry VI. But once he's got the crown, he has to face up to his own problems. Now, in the case of Robert Baratheon and Edward IV, those are pretty much personal, what we'd now call issues.
Edward was a great warrior, but once the battles were over, he couldn't keep his breeches laced up, and drink and whoring were his downfall.
Robert Baratheon was known for his drinking, his luxury, excessive eating, but also his success in battle. And these are all things that Edward IV is known for as well.
There sits the only king I mean to bend my knee to. The King of the North! The King of the North! The King of the North! The King of the North!
There's a little bit of Edward IV in Rob, too. You know, Rob is, in some ways, the early Edward IV.
Treason. You're summoned to King's Landing to swear fealty to the new king.
After Richard of York is killed, his teenage son, Edward, becomes the Duke of York and leads his armies and wins several victories over the Lancasters, while still a teenager and a very young man.
His Grace summons me to King's Landing. I'll go to King's Landing. But not alone. Call the banners.
Edward IV, or the future Edward IV, is only 18 years old. Young guy. He's passionate, impulsive, and a brilliant military commander. He was never defeated on the field of battle. And Tywin Lannister's whole problem with Robb Stark is he keeps winning.
Stark won't risk marching on Casterly Rock until he's at full force.
He's a boy and he's never lost a battle. He'll risk anything at any time.
And of course, like Robb, Edward married unwisely to a woman he met while on campaign.
I don't want to marry the Frey girl.
The difference between Robb Stark and Edward IV is Edward IV successfully overthrows Henry VI and becomes king, where Robb Stark gets killed at the Red Wedding.
The Red Wedding, man, it's the iconic episode, right? It's almost too crazy to be true, except George has said he was taking his inspiration from real history.
George R.R. Martin has taken several different events, specifically drawing from Scottish history, and mixed them up together to create the Red Wedding.
Scottish history is an amazing source for all of this because it's one of the most incredibly bloody histories of any country that I've ever studied.
He was looking at the Black Dinner of 1440, held at the court of the boy king James II of Scotland.
The Black Dinner occurred when the King of Scotland was having a dispute with the Black Douglases. The Lord of Douglas was a young man, 18 or 19 years old, kind of a Robb Stark figure, and he brought his even younger brother with him, and they had a marvelous feast, and everybody was having a great old time. But then when the feast was over, a single drum began to play, just boom, boom, boom.
Men rushed in, grabbed the Earl and his brother, dragged him outside and beheaded them.
Now, the other half of it, of course, was the Glencoe Massacre, which was a few centuries later. The Campbells came to the town of Glencoe, which was a MacDonald town, and they stayed overnight with the MacDonalds. But there were these laws of hospitality in Scotland that were very time-honored and obeyed, just as in Westeros. The MacDonalds fed the Campbells, and they gave them water, and they gave them shelter from the storm. And then in the middle of the night, their guests rose up from their beds and started killing every MacDonald they could get their hands on. You know, guests slaughtering their hosts. In case of the Red Wedding, I reversed that.
The Lannisters send their regards.
It's those two incidents I blended together to make the Red Wedding.
Last time I saw Rob, he was in the courtyard of Winterfell. He was better than me at everything. I wanted to hate him, but I never could.
Jon Snow, I think, is everyone's favourite hero of Game of Thrones. And we really root for him because of his status in life. He's a bastard.
A bastard boy with nothing to inherit, off to join the ancient order of the Night's Watch.
In Westeros, Jon Snow finds his way in the world by becoming a soldier, by becoming a knightly character.
Lord Snow here grew up in a castle, spitting down on the likes of you. Do you think Ned Stark's bastard bleeds like the rest of us?
Noble and royal bastards would be in similar situations in the Middle Ages. They were quite aware that they weren't at the same level or had the same status within the family as their brothers and sisters.
The draw for a bastard like Jon Snow of going north to the Wall and joining the Night's Watch is that it's an opportunity for him to make a career for himself.
Welcome.
1,000 foot of ice wall. Now that's a creative genius. We don't know of any ice walls like that. But we do have Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall's 70 plus miles. And the Romans did it. Why? Because they didn't really want the Scots down with them.
The wall was a defensive measure. It was Hadrian drawing the boundaries of the empire and saying, on this side, civilization, on that side, wilderness, madness, savagery, and we want to keep it there.
I'm sure the Scots today would be very offended to be compared to wildlings, but in the Middle Ages, that was exactly how they were seen, certainly in England.
When I came to write Ice and Fire, I knew I wanted to have a wall, but of course, you know, in my philosophy of turning it up to 11, I actually turned it up to, I think, at least 37 in this case, because I made my wall 700 feet high and made of ice and magic, keeping out unimaginable evils beyond, instead of just Scotsmen.
But what we have in Westeros, of course, living or patrolling the Wall is the Night's Watch. It's a place where all the brothers are equal, where your past doesn't matter, where you can get on in life and, by the power of your sword.
Well, Lord Snow, it appears you're the least useless person here.
I think there's certainly an element of that in some of the warrior monks of the Middle Ages.
Hear my words and bear witness to my vow. Night gathers, and now my watch begins.
A lot of the stuff about the Night's Watch comes from the church militant of the Crusades, the Templars and the Hospitallers. They were sworn to poverty and obedience. They were sworn to chastity.
I shall take no wife. Yes, that's in there. There's no denying that. I shall father no children. It's very specific. But what our vows have to say about other activities is open to interpretation.
But they were also warriors, and there were several different orders, though the one that lasted the longest was a Knights Hospitaller, who initially began in the hospital in Jerusalem. Their great rival was the Templars, who were even more powerful.
Knights Templar, what do we know of the Knights Templar? Well, they were sworn to protect Jerusalem, did not have an ice wall around it, but nevertheless they had this duty to defend the Christian lands in the Middle East.
So there's, you know, huge history of these military orders of essentially fighting monks.
I'm a brother of the Night's Watch. I don't know what I have left to give you.
You can give me the North.
Even if I wanted to, I'm a bastard. The Snow.
Kneel before me. Lay your sword at my feet. Pledge me your service, and you'll rise again as Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell.
I think Westeros is set in a feudal society. Ask Jon Snow if this is a feudal world. He's going to tell you, of course it is. He's a bastard, he's born outside it. It's king-led, there are noble houses. The idea of your birthright is potent.
The firstborn heir, male heir, is the most important person. So Robb Stark is the most important person in the Stark family. In the very first episode, you see the Stark children lining up to greet Robert Baratheon. Well, they're lined up in order of age and gender. So Robb Stark, who's the oldest boy, is first. Then Sansa is second. Arya is third, but she's late, and Bran is standing in her place, and she shoves him out of the way because she's the one that's supposed to be there.
So in that very basic sense, we're talking about an aristocratic world in which your birth is, in a sense, your destiny. Yes, Westeros is a feudal system, although it's a feudal system, of course, complicated by White Walkers and dragons.
I did not go full feudal, but I have a quasi-feudal system where there are landed knights and lords who have castles, who swear fealty to the king. So there's this network of obligations.
You have lower lords, like Eddard Stark's vassals in the north.
All those high lords, they all thought they were better than me. Ned Stark, Hoster Tully.
People like Roose Bolton, who kind of chafe a little that they have to bend the knee.
No more Starks to bow and scrape to. Must have been torture following that stupid boy all over the country.
He ignored my advice at every turn.
That relationship of having to serve a lord, an overlord militarily, as well as support them in other matters, was very common in the Middle Ages.
I need you, Ned. I have a son, you have a daughter. We'll join our houses.
Marriage in Westeros is, to some extent, based on marriage in the real Middle Ages, or even in certain ancient cultures. Marriage was a form of political alliance. It was a way to bind two families together.
So medieval nobles would consider their marriages the way a corporate CEO might consider a merger.
The young wolf has lost half his army, his days are numbered. Theon Greyjoy murdered both his brothers. That makes Sansa Stark the heir to Winterfell. You will wed her, bed her, and put a child in her. Tyrion will do as he's bid. As will you.
What do you mean?
You'll marry Sir Loras.
I will not.
The boy is heir to High Garden. Tyrion will secure the north, you will secure the Reach.
No, I won't do it.
Yes, you will.
Individuals are, in a large part, defined and often struggling against what they've been born into.
I can't marry him. You can't make me. He is a traitor, a murderer.
You're not marrying Roose Bolton. No, you'll be marrying his son and heir, Ramsay.
I will starve myself. I will die before I have to go there.
I won't force you to do anything.
When you look at the Wars of the Roses, there's one character, Elizabeth of York, who's sort of traded a little bit in exactly the same way that Sansa Stark is. So Elizabeth of York basically became a political pawn between different families all circling the real English crown.
Please let me go home. I won't do any treason, I swear.
Mother says I'm still to marry you, so you'll stay here and obey.
Sansa may be based on a specific character, but she may also just be an amalgamation of every single daughter of every single king, of every single kingdom in the entire Middle Ages from the beginning to the end. Daughters were used as bargaining chips.
I know how to play a man like Drogo. I give him a queen, and he gives me an army.
I don't want to be his queen. I want to go home.
We go home with an army, with Khal Drogo's army.
What are the historical influences on the Dothraki? Well, I think you can see a lot of the Mongols in the Dothraki, in the 13th century when Genghis Khan and his successors were burning everywhere from Beijing to Baghdad.
They also have a lot of the Huns in them, who were a similar nomadic horse people who came out of Asia 1,000 years earlier.
The Huns, like the Dothraki, spent all their time on horseback. They slept on horseback, they made love on horseback, they negotiated diplomatic treaties on horseback.
Where's he going?
The ceremony is over.
But he didn't say anything. Did he like her?
Trust me, Your Grace. If he didn't like her, we'd know.
I think he's hit the nomadic warrior perfectly. Whether it's a Mongol or a Hun or any of those guys that come off the Central Steppes, they move as communities. Everybody is tied to the way of life. Women are every bit as wild as the men are.
But I think there's also quite a bit of Native American culture that's feeding into the Dothraki. What we know of, let's say, the Comanche tribe is, and it's a very well-groomed culture. There was a great pride in the warrior's appearance. We know that the Dothraki grow their hair and their braids until they're defeated in battle and then cut them off. And I think this real concern with the physical projection of the warrior spirit, there's a little bit of Native American there.
But I took some elements that were purely fantasy to try to create something that was grounded in reality, but was not necessarily just a Xerox of reality.
She truly is a queen today.
Daenerys Targaryen, what an amazing character out there over the water, and we're just waiting for her to arrive, right, with these dragons above her.
Dany is perhaps the most intriguing character to try to match up historically. Joan of Arc, of course, is one that you want to compare Dany to. Problem, of course, is she gets burned, and she doesn't come out of the flames with dragons. Dany, of course, does.
If we are going to say that Westeros is a sort of mirror image of the Wars of the Roses, and there's one character that Dany looks very, very much like, except it's not a woman. It's Henry Tudor, who spent a lot of his life in exile.
Henry VII, who was known as Henry Tudor before he became King of England, spent most of his life hiding in France, kind of like Viserys and Daenerys when they're hiding with Illyrio.
It won't be long now. Soon you will cross the narrow sea and take back your father's throne.
Henry VII was hiding abroad to avoid being captured and killed.
The whore is pregnant.
You're speaking of murdering a child.
I want him dead. Mother and child both. Is that plain enough for you?
But he came back to fulfill the prophecies, ancient Welsh prophecies, and when he marched back to England, above his armies fluttered a flag with a dragon on it. But I don't think you can just say that Dany is Henry Tudor and that's that, because I think there's a lot of classical ancient history that's been put into that character as well. So there's a little bit of Alexander the Great, who was a king who conquered huge swathes of territory and took lots of different peoples along with him. But I think there's a lot of Cleopatra in there as well. A very, very strong female character who is in some senses always struggling with the consequences and the obligations of power.
I did not take up residence in this pyramid so I could watch the city below decline into chaos.
We see in season 5, Dany's living in a pyramid. Well, Cleopatra came from Egypt, and I don't want to be too flip about it, but I sense a lot of Cleopatra folded in with a big dollop of Henry Tudor, with these dragons flying above her. A big part of Dany's story is her journey around Slaver's Bay and her kind of puzzling out her relationship with the slaves whom she gathers into her army.
Some say the Unsullied are the greatest soldiers in the world.
The greatest slave soldiers in the world.
Slave soldiers, they go way back. And so the Unsullied can be matched up to the troops that the Spartans had. They can be matched up to the Mamluks, who were probably our most famous slave armies.
One of the most successful Islamic dynasties in the Crusades were slave armies, the Mamluks. And I think when we look at the Unsullied, I see a lot of the Mamluks in there, as well as a bit of the Spartans, people who've been selected purely for their fighting ability.
They may suit my needs. Tell me of their training.
Well, the Unsullied are loosely based on some of the slave soldiers of history, the Mamluks of Egypt, the Janissaries of the Turkish Empire. Similar groups who were children taken from their parents as slaves and trained solely for the purpose of being warriors.
Slaves don't like being slaves. And when a person like Dany comes in and offers them freedom, almost everyone, especially the young ones, are going to want to get freedom to pursue their own interests.
I don't expect the wise masters to be happy. Slavery made them rich. I ended slavery.
They do not ask for the return of slavery. They ask for the reopening of the fighting pits.
The fighting pits, where slaves fought slaves to the death.
Having humans slaughter each other for entertainment, that's gone on for centuries. But I think, if you were going to pick a time when it had been very popular, it's ancient Rome, isn't it? It's the Colosseum. So the fighting pits that George has invented, I think, hark directly back to ancient Rome.
It was actually the Etruscans who began gladiatorial games, and of course the Romans conquered the Etruscans. They picked up some of their habits, including that one.
Those games, gladiatorial matches, they're pretty fierce.
It's a sport, but of course it's a blood sport. If you make a mistake, you die.
Slaves are given a possible promise they're going to get freedom. As far as we know, very few do.
I think when you look at the cities of Slavers Bay, it's really reminiscent of what I always imagine ancient Egypt must have looked like. Very exotic, the people very different to the rest of the Mediterranean. This really huge monumental architecture that just looms over everyone who approaches it. There's so much of Cleopatra and North Africa in the ancient world, all in that little area of Slavers Bay. And it's a really great counterpoint to the rest of Westeros. I think you could look at the Wars of the Roses and try and work out where George is going. I think you could do that. I think you'd also run the risk of going insane.
Everything in the world is grist for the mill, be it, real life or contemporary events or history. I mean, it's all stuff that you can take and rework and make into stories.
Whatever happens in the end in Westeros, maybe it will map the Wars of the Roses. Maybe we'll be sitting there going, oh, this was exactly what happened. Or maybe it'll just be whatever George wants it to be.
It occurred to me that if I tweaked it just a little and I added some fantasy elements and changed the characters, then now you have all the appeal of the Wars of the Roses, but you also have unpredictability. You don't know who's going to win. You don't know who's going to die.